Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Bradley, a Senior Director at RSG, and have the pleasure of moderating this user group meeting today. I think it's going to be a different and pretty interesting one. We have a lot of speakers about different aspects or different approaches to measuring travel impacts from COVID as most of the agenda. So I'm going to get started on that so we have some time. Unless, are there any more introductory things we have to go through, Carol, or can we get started?
No, I think we can go ahead and get started. Mark, just for you, I will note we don't have our panelists yet from Arizona State University and UC Davis, but I did get an acceptance from them, so hopefully
yeah.
they will join a little bit later.
I'm guessing they'll be last minute.
Yeah. Okay. So
let's see. So I have somewhere here a bio. So our first speaker is Becky Knudsen, a senior transportation economist for Oregon Department of Transportation. She has responsibilities ranging from program management to technical analysis. She develops and applies economic, land use, and transportation forecast models for use in long-range planning and policy analysis, such as the Oregon statewide integrated model. She's worked for ODOT for 24 years. She moved to Oregon from North Dakota after earning a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Minnesota, Moorhead, and then followed by earning a master's degree in economics from Oregon State University. Okay, so if you want to share your screen, Becky, and we can get started.
Okay. My goal is always to do this in one shot instead of the multiple tries I often see when I'm in these meetings. All right, can you confirm that you can see my slides correctly?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, now I'll get this stuff out of the way. All right. Welcome, everybody. This presentation today will highlight information reported by the Oregon Department of Transportation in a report that began March of 2020. These reports are still all posted online and you can access them if you'd like to learn more about the traffic patterns. I will touch on the primary reporting, but in the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail. If you're really interested in more, you can look at the reports, and we also have questions and after the presentation. So basically, I'll talk about why we did the report and how we did it using our traffic data. And then we were able to add some interesting regional analysis, which I think is really the highlight of the report, although it's not really part of the primary purpose, but we tried to add more and more information as time went on, and we automated our process and our text. But before I go any further, I have to give big kudos to Katie Brown. She's an engineer in my unit. I started doing all this myself. I'm not a traffic engineer. As you heard Mark say, I'm an economist. So when Katie was brought on board as a co-author, I feel like we did a much better job. And she actually took on that regional reporting part of the report. So she got to do some really fun stuff. So kudos to Katie Brown. So when the quarantine began, people were really hungry for information. And at times this report was seen as an opportunity to do much more expansive analysis. So we heard that internally to ODOT, can you look more into how people are walking, or are they riding bike more, or just hearsay was being thrown around, and we were asked if we could confirm it or reveal different patterns. But
we to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by.
So we did not have the data. or the labor hours to really expand this report beyond the basic mandates that we were meeting for the agency. We focused on monitoring the major state highways in a manner that revealed overall patterns and trends. So that was the primary purpose of this. We had 4 distinct customer bases in mind for the report. The governor's office wanted to monitor the public response to the quarantine mandate, and traffic was one indicator. So definitely an interest there. But the Oregon Health Authority was probably the main focus because they use the traffic data for their modeling and forecasting related to the infection rate for COVID-19. So they were really the primary customer for this. Now, ODOT internally had a lot of questions as well. So I turned out to be serving the needs of many different aspects of the department, and then we would refine the report as we move forward. And finally, reporters wanted to know what was going on and beyond their region and be able to, share this information with the public. And I have to tell you, you're doing a pretty good job when reporters take your text verbatim and they paste it into their newspaper or their journal, because usually they don't do that. So I just thought that was a real big kudos for our work. We did use multiple data sources, started out with the basic traffic data, but then as time went on and we wanted to add information, we took advantage of some new speed data we had access to for ODOT, and then also looked into some truck data for other reasons, but it fit well within the report, so we included it. So here's the big punchline that everyone wanted to see every week, and then in time that turned into every other week. And then we were able to report monthly as the economy kind of started coming back to more normal levels. So at first, the weekly reporting was very quick timeline for us. So this graph is showing you 3 years of data side by side. The most recent data for 2021 is the blue line that's outlined in black, so it stands out further. The lightest blue, basically the lower line, that's your 2020 volumes that really dropped during the COVID mandates. And then finally, 2019 was another reference year because that was considered more of a normal year. So we wanted to see how traffic volumes compared to previous years, but we had to have that basic 2019 normal conditions to compare to. And this reveals pretty quickly how the volumes dropped when the mandate was put into place. It also shows you little shocks to the system, such as an ice storm in February of 2021. And we also had wildfires, which in September of 2020. And those impacts were regional to a point, but they also showed up in this statewide data as well. Now this graph is showing you weekday patterns. We also followed weekend patterns. It involves different trip purposes. So we were curious to see if there was much of a difference on the weekends. And obviously they were also impacted by the mandates, but the patterns were a little bit different. And we would go in and do a little more detailed analysis here and there if we had like unexpectedly good weather to see if people were rushing off to counties that had looser mandates as far as stores being open and activities being allowed. We didn't see a lot of that actually, but we did see a lot of people going to the coast or going to the mountains when the weather was nice on the weekends. So it's interesting that the data could actually show us those patterns as well. But as far as weekend travel, we're really back to 2019 levels, very close. So what we did is we monitored 13 state highway corridors. We did this by using 38 automatic traffic recorder locations. There were people that wanted to conduct their own analysis in the agency and also reporters that are interested in their region. So we included this reporting table so people had the data right there in front of them and they could dig in deeper if they wanted to. As I mentioned before, we integrated further information beyond the traffic data as the report moved on and we started automating things and having a little more time for other analysis. So we shared information related to traffic speeds to look at congestion levels, and then also the truck volumes. So this graph shows you speeds on I-5 in the Portland metropolitan area. So ODOT recently implemented the Regional Integrated Transportation Information System. That's RITIS. I will probably never have to say that out loud. It's known as RITIS to me now on. And it uses INRIX data, INRIX speed data. So this example on the screen illustrates the speed for the afternoon peak hour on Interstate 5 in the Portland area. And you see the posted speed is the black line straight across at 55 miles an hour. So it's easy to see when the speeds move above posted speed. That's what happens when you see the mandates in place. Traffic really drops, so speeds approach or exceed the posted speed. Another example of a shock that really reduced traffic enough to bring speeds up to posted was the wildfires in September of 2020. This visibility in the Portland area was horrible. You couldn't really drive. It was almost as bad as a blizzard. So the traffic volumes really dropped, and we saw that in the speed data. If you'd like to know more about RITIS, this is a fairly new tool for us, but we're really rolling it out. We're using it more and more, and we're integrating more and more data into the system. I've included the link to the ODOT RITIS page if you're curious to learn more, and that's at the bottom of this slide. We also monitored truck volumes. So we have automatic traffic recorders that do bin the vehicles that pass those points into length bins. And you can infer vehicle weight size by those length bins. So we separated the traffic counts into light, medium, and heavy vehicles. And that was at 30 different locations. So really the reason that we did this was related to forecasting our revenue related to trucks, because we have a weight mile tax for trucks over 26,000 pounds. We really had no idea what was going to happen to our revenue. It was really, really a tough time for a revenue forecaster during 2020. So this helped a little bit with that. We also are interested in freight movement. So we understood that there was an increase in e-commerce. So we wanted to see what the traffic data could tell us in these areas of performance and activity. And it was a new source of data for me, and I found it very revealing. I'd like to spend time looking more into it in the future, but I think if people haven't worked with this kind of data, they should think about it. It could be very useful, more than you think. So then just for this presentation, I was curious to look at traffic volume, a real quick and easy way. And this is just an indexed graphic of the traffic volumes, all indexed to early March. So how did things change since early March prior to the COVID mandates? And you can see that a lot of the patterns are relatively similar. And then it gets a little noisy in the middle there, where September through the winter, but it is interesting just to see how there are similarities and there are differences. And it just invites us to look into it more. So I thought I'd pique your interest with that little graph. Kind of at the work level, we use this automatic traffic recorder data, but there was always a 3-day lag. It takes time to retrieve the data, send the data, process the data, do QA, QC. We worked so hard to try and get this to real time, and this was the closest we could come, which is really good, I mean, from our perspective. And customers learned to accept it. They weren't too unhappy after a while. And then in the middle of this reporting, we changed our traffic assignment, or our traffic data platform. We could no longer retrieve it the way we had been. And that was stressful because we had to meet our deadlines and our mandates. So all I can say is that Oregon Department of Transportation and my co-author, Katie, they're the best. And everybody, it just took a huge team and a lot of resources to make this happen and get that data. So now the interesting stuff, from my perspective, while we're in the middle of this, our manager, Brian Dunn, said, hey, you know, I wonder if those traffic patterns differ by region. I mean, are there differences in urban areas versus rural? Or is it basically the same across the state? And we thought, well, that's an interesting question. Let's look into it. So that was Katie's job, is to explore this question. So we looked at the Interstate 5 corridor that goes north and south. Then we looked at the Interstate 84, goes east-west from Portland towards Boise. And then US 97 goes through the middle of the state. It is a major freight corridor, but it does have an urban area, Bend area. So we had an opportunity to use these 3 corridors to explore this question. And then this table is basically the big punchline for what we found. So you're looking at the corridor level values. That was what was in the overall statewide chart. That's what you saw in the table for the 13 corridors. So overall traffic in 2021 was only 4% lower than 2019. 2021 traffic was actually 41% higher on I-5 than the 2020 levels. But when you look at the segments that are rural, more rural than urban, there are distinct differences. So at Interstate 5, the Portland area is a large part of the state volume. So it really skews the statewide results. But when you looked at the Willamette Valley alone, which is urbanized, but not as densely as Portland, the outcomes, the impact to traffic is a little bit less in the Portland area. And then when you get to the more rural segment, the southern end of Interstate 5, it is different outcomes, especially the comparing it to 2019, the volumes are actually higher than 2019. So these patterns were really telling. And so we went through it for Interstate 84 and looked at how it differed in the urban and the rural area. And then we could even zoom in on little pieces here and there when questions popped up. But this was really interesting. This was for the weekday. We also did it for the weekend volumes. There we go. Okay. So similarly, we saw these different patterns statewide versus the different segments of the corridors. So on the weekend, Interstate 5, the southern end of the state, again, had volumes higher than 2019. So there was growth in parts of the area, but then Portland, where it's really dense and urbanized, the volumes were much lower compared to the other areas. And we saw similar patterns on US 97 and I-84. So that was an interesting opportunity to look at kind of the behavioral side. We did face multiple challenges. Gosh, you know, it's so easy to interpret the data incorrectly when you have incomplete information. So we had to be very cautious of inferring things that were maybe associated with COVID mandates versus other activity like weather. We had wildfires. I mean, that was an unprecedented wildfire event. And we had different days of the week. We had to align the data. So we're really comparing a Monday to a Monday to a Monday for all 3 years, and understand that the holidays affect behavior. There's construction work zones, and we had equipment failures up and down from lightning strikes and flooding and fires. And we had a lot of things to check as we move forward before we started inferring cause and effect. And the estimating missing data, that was definitely Katie's job. As a traffic engineer, she was the master and I wasn't. So glad to have an expert there to do that. And then our curiosity would get the best of us and we would start expanding content because we were curious, but then that impacts the deadline. So we had to really keep ourselves focused on and adhere to the purpose of that report and meet that deadline, or we were in trouble. So lots of pressure there. So, you know, I guess this isn't very sophisticated analytically. However, it really served the needs of the agency where we had customers that wanted information, they wanted it right now, and they needed it regularly, but it needed to be defensible and documented and automated to the extent possible. So we did that, and we had these dedicated contact people, so our stories were consistent and the information was valid and current. We responded quickly, kept our eye on the prize, just meeting our goals and timelines. And then we had to de-engineer it and de-economist language it and just keep it as simple as possible, but also do some education and information as while we had the audience there. So it was a really good experience, I think, for ODOT and also for our customers. We have 35 reports posted online. The link is on the bottom of this slide here. They are going to remain there for a while. We no longer produce the report. We ended it July 2021. We are monitoring the counts a little bit because the health authority still needs data, but we're hoping to write like an end of year report, but I'm not sure if we'll have time or resources to do that. So that really covers everything I intended to share. If you have any questions, now is a good time to ask.
Okay, thank you, Becky. We have time for some questions. If anybody has any? Well, while you're thinking, there is a, Carol put in the chat box, Becky, if maybe after the questions, if you could put links to the reports, traffic reports, and the RITIS in the chat box.
Sure, will do. Looks like Elliot has his hand raised.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. I'm just wondering, have you done any, it sounds like it's been a busy time over there, so no pressure, but I was curious, have you done any work to look at what that, 4 to 8% reduction in volumes on urban highways translates into in terms of congestion?
We haven't done it in a real detailed way, but we have that information now. We could do that. That would be interesting because we monitored performance on congestion for 5 highways in the Portland area. Now, I also know Region 1 of ODOT is doing their own analysis, but it's a little different than ours. So the answer is no, we have not done that kind of research, but it would be very interesting to do. And so now you've planted the seed for that kind of analysis.
Okay, there's a question from Garth Apanatis in the box. 2021 growth over 2019 in rural areas is interesting. Any additional diagnostics on the cause?
I think part of really it's a little bit speculative, but watching how the COVID mandates would designate counties to having a certain level of risk. And as their risk dropped, then the restrictions also declined. So places like Deschutes County in the Bend area, they were able to open up restaurants and have more activity earlier than other counties. And we saw more activity. Southern Oregon, they had pretty good numbers when it came to hospitalizations and COVID infections. So they weren't as restricted. Yet we didn't see as much movement from one region to another as we thought. So we think a lot of it is just kind of localized traffic, people getting out there and doing activity, but we didn't dig in super deep, but we kind of collected anecdotal information from our regional staff that were there seeing it in person. It's not much of an answer, but yeah, we didn't really have time to look into it. We would have needed a lot more data, talk to people.
Yeah, I was wondering if there would be pent-up demand for recreational travel that you would see, but that would be more inter-county travel. So maybe not.
Yeah, and we did have a question once. It was very direct. It was very clear. It was, the weather was really nice last week, and did everybody, go to the coast? And that was a Portland question, and ended up, everybody went to Mount Hood. But that was really interesting because, yeah, we saw a pattern. It just wasn't the one that the requester expected. And we had another direct question saying, Deschutes County has Bend in it. Are people leaving Portland like crazy and going to Deschutes County? And there's only a couple of highways that go that way. And we could say, no, the flows do not support that hypothesis. So, but those are the only two examples that we got to look into.
Yeah, I was also wondering if there would be much induced demand because of the lower traffic speeds. That would be more in the urban areas, I suppose.
Yeah, and how would you figure that out? Because induced demand, there's a trip purpose. So if there's a lot of activity that's closed, what activity is left that people can do? We saw a lot of localized traffic, even in my little town of 16,000 people. It seemed like it was busier than usual. And yet you get out on the state highways between cities, it was very quiet. So it's really a puzzle. I'd love to dig in and learn more, but the induced demand would be hard because it doesn't impact speeds. How do you tease it out? How do you find
Yeah,
it?
and there's so much else going on at the same.
Surveys.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are surveys that have been going on during the COVID, like RSG has one that's fascinating. People should look into, but we didn't have anything like that going on in Oregon at the time.
Well, a few of the people were in Oregon, but it was a
Right.
national survey. So yeah.
Right.
Any other questions?
All right. Well, 4-second rule. I think we're done and we can move on to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Becky.
Thanks.
Let's see. So if you want to share your screen, Anna, and I'll read a short bio here if I can find it. So Anna Johnson joined the Oregon Employment Department in 2017 and currently serves as the Senior Economic Analyst. Her work focuses on labor trends across Oregon and labor market issues affecting workers and employers. Prior to moving to Oregon, she was a research analyst for a bipartisan legislative committee in Mississippi. Ms. Johnson holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Winthrop University and a master's in economic policy from Tulane. In her free time, she enjoys playing tennis, hiking, reading, and attempting new recipes from her too large collection of baking books. All right.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Johnson, and like Mark said, I am the Senior Economic Analyst for the Oregon Employment Department. Today, I am going to talk to y'all about the labor impacts of the pandemic recession and how the recovery has been looking so far. I do have some construction going on in my house, one of the hazards of working from home. So if you hear some noises in the background, I'm sorry about that, but we're gonna power through. So I think it'll be okay. Yeah, so I'm not a transportation expert, but I do know a little bit about labor markets, and I hope I can provide some good background information for you guys to kind of give you an idea of what's been going on in Oregon over the past really tumultuous 18 months. So let's just jump into it. In 2020, in April 2020, Oregon's unemployment rate shot up from a near record low to a record high, basically overnight from about 3.5% in the beginning of 2020 to 13.2%. This was a record high during the Great
Actually, you're breaking up a little bit. Maybe if you turn
the unemployment rate
Oh.
reached 11. Should I turn my video off?
Yeah, if you
Maybe that
turn
will
your
help.
video off, that could help. Yeah.
Okay, how about now? Am I still breaking up?
No, that sounds better.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, but since April, our unemployment rate has been steadily decreasing. And in September, it reached 4.7%, very similar to the US. It is back to, although we're not back to the record lows that we were seeing prior to the pandemic, we are below the long run average going back to 1976, below 6%. So we're making good progress. And just a little bit of background information, the unemployment rate is based on a survey of households, so it includes self-employed people and farm workers, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you're receiving unemployment insurance. You're considered unemployed if you are not working and you are available to work and currently looking for work. So in September, about 100,000 Oregonians were unemployed. This is a really remarkable improvement from the worst of the labor market impacts of the COVID recession, when 270,000 Oregonians were jobless in April 2020. However, there's still ground to make up to approach the average of 82,000 Oregonians unemployed during the 2017-2019 tight labor market of the economic expansion. And then kind of along with just the total number of unemployed persons changing really dramatically, the reasons why people were unemployed has been changing over the course of the recession and recovery. At the beginning of the pandemic, you can see most people who are unemployed were considered job losers, as opposed to entrants or job leavers. And that number has been, the number of people who have lost their job has been steadily dropping throughout the recovery. And really interestingly, the number of people who have left their jobs voluntarily has been increasing, and it currently represents 14% of the unemployed in September. Now I'm going to switch to jobs numbers, and this comes from a survey of Oregon's business establishments asking about their payroll jobs. So it's a different survey than what we use to calculate the unemployment rate. So the numbers look a little different. So while we've been experiencing a decline in the unemployment rate, in September, we had a really extreme stop in job growth. This graph is pretty unreadable, but I like to show it because it shows the monthly gains or losses in Oregon, and it really illustrates how extreme job losses of little red bars over here. This was the Great Recession, and now it's, you know, it doesn't even look that bad compared to April of 2020. And the job growth that we've been experiencing since then is record high levels. But after we were averaging about 10,000 job gains a month from January to August, the loss of 200 jobs in September was a really notable slowdown. But this picture kind of looks different from one area of Oregon's economy to the next. So if we look at the industries individually, it shows a really different picture. By September 2021, Oregon had regained 72% of the jobs they lost in spring. Some industries are fully recovered and have expanded to make up. So in this graph, the dark blue part of the bar represents the initial deficit that the industry lost in spring 2020. And then the green part of that bar shows how much of that they have recovered. So leisure and hospitality down at the bottom is still, has a ways to make up from the really extreme job losses that they saw. But these industries up here with the bright blue bar have surpassed their levels that they saw in February 2020. And those industries are professional and technical services, which is companies that provide a mix of architectural, engineering, computer design, and other services, transportation, warehousing and utilities, and state government. So if we look at transportation, warehousing, utilities, it's been one of the few that has been gaining significant jobs throughout the pandemic. And really surged during 2020 while many people turned to online shopping and delivery, and we needed more truck drivers, we needed more warehousing to store those all those delivery items in, and really stood out in stark contrast to most of the rest of Oregon's economy in 2020. This sector added 1,000 jobs in September, and they have almost 4,000 more jobs than they did prior to the recession. And as holiday shopping starts to pick up at the end of this year, it's quite possible that the job growth in this industry will continue to be really strong. Another important industry that's been really affected during the pandemic and the recovery is healthcare and social assistance. We kind of jokingly, but not quite a joke, refer to this industry as recession proof, but at the beginning of the pandemic, that was proven very incorrect. And as people kind of shut down like non-emergency services and routine checkups and dentist offices were closed, the sector lost a lot of jobs. And after a pretty strong initial gain after spring of 2020, it's been really flat over the last couple months, which is concerning to a lot of people because we're still in a pandemic and healthcare providers are very important. But it looks a little different across the different sectors. While they're all still down from their February 2020 employment, ambulatory services, which is like the doctors of offices, dentists, chiropractors, other specialists, have been adding jobs and have been steadily increasing pretty consistently. Hospitals, however, have had a slight job loss over the year. And then nursing and residential care facilities have lost about 3,000 jobs over the competition for workers is really complicating hiring for healthcare places right now. And nursing and residential care facilities in particular, they tended to lose workers to hospitals prior to the pandemic because of wages usually, and there was a lot of COVID exposure in those locations early in the pandemic too. And I don't have any data on this, but it's possible that there may be a reduced demand for workers if a large number of families opt to not place their loved ones in a nursing care facility because of the pandemic at this time. And then another big one is the leisure and hospitality industry. They've been hiring at a good pace with an average of 3,500 jobs a month so far in 2021. It has regained 62% of the jobs lost in spring 2020. And they're working their way back from the 111,000 jobs that they lost in the spring of 2020. And this industry tended to lose workers to other industries prior to the recession and the pandemic. There was a lot of turnover, and they haven't been losing more workers to other industries. That still kind of turnover is happening. But it's a challenge to lose those workers to other industries when it's already hard to find people for all of your jobs. But to keep it in perspective, even though they've only gained back 62% of the jobs that they lost, they've hired as much in the last 9 months as they did in the 64 months before the recession. So there's a lot of competition for workers. And I think a lot of people really expected for hiring to pick up really quickly when the federally expanded unemployment insurance benefits ended. But we did take a look at the group of unemployment insurance claimants who were expected to lose their benefits at the beginning of February. And if the 8,400 workers who were in accommodation and food services before becoming unemployed went back to that industry after they lost their pandemic unemployment insurance benefits, that would only fill about 20% of that industry's gap to get back to a full jobs recovery. So the employment recovery compared to the US, where this is shows employment trends indexed to January 2020. And we've been moving, following a really similar trend to the US, who added 194,000 jobs in September, which would have been a pretty typical month of job growth before the pandemic, but it's a really significant slowdown from the 1.1 million jobs added in July and the 366,000 added in August. But our winter growth really slowed down and compared to the US in the end of 2020, but we've been picking up and moving in a similar direction as the US since then. And another kind of difference in this recession in recovery, there's been some really big changes in the average hourly wages. This is for private non-farm jobs only. And this is the 12-month moving average adjusted for inflation. But at the beginning of pandemic, we saw average wages rise, but this was mostly because the jobs that were lost in spring of 2020 were some of the lowest paying jobs, which really drove up the average. But as those jobs started to come back, the average continued to rise and keep increasing. But over the last few months, we're starting to see those wages decrease again. And in September, the average hourly wage was about $30.57. And so that's kind of the employment and unemployment perspective. And I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about business perspective. Each quarter, we survey private employers for all industries and areas of the state to ask about their job vacancies that they are actively trying to fill. So in the summer quarter, Oregon businesses reported almost 107,000 vacancies. This was a total job openings increase of 9% from the spring and 130% from the summer of 2020. And this is the highest number of job vacancies we've seen in Oregon since the beginning of the survey in 2013. In spring 2021, the number of vacancies reached the previous record of 97,800. And before that, the high was 66,000 vacancies in the summer of 2017. And while we ask about if they have any vacancies, we also ask for some information about those vacancies. And most of them were for full-time permanent positions. Education beyond high school was required for about 27% of summer vacancies. And in line with what we saw in the previous slide, the average starting wage reported in the summer was $19.19, but that was a slight inflation adjusted decrease from summer 2020. And we also ask employers if they're having a difficult time filling the vacancies that they had. And if they are difficult to fill, we ask them to give us an open-ended response as to why. And overall, 78% of vacancies were considered difficult to fill in the summer, which was another record high for the series. And to illustrate how hiring troubles are in Oregon and around the US, if we look at the unemployed to job vacancy ratio for the US and for Oregon in the summer, it was there was one unemployed person per job vacancy, which makes, again, kind of like illustrates the competition that there is for workers right now. For all the job openings, there's only one available person who is actively looking for work. And there's all sorts of things that can complicate that, such as, where your skills are needed and the experience that you have and what employers are looking for. They can really make it hard to find workers. And then, but businesses were hiring in industries across the state. Healthcare and social assistance was had the highest number of vacancies, which has been the case for most of the past 23 quarters. The leisure and hospitality industry had the next highest number of vacancies, and so did retail, trade, and manufacturing. And employers reported vacancies in more than 270 different occupations. The ones with the most vacancies in the summer were retail salespersons, restaurant cooks, personal care aides, truck drivers, and maids and housekeeping cleaners. And for the reasons why their vacancies were difficult to fill, many employers reported, or most employers reported, that it was just a general lack of applications or a lack of qualified candidates that were making hiring for their vacancies very difficult. And then and separately, we have been tracking over the past couple quarters how many employers mention, or how many vacancies mention high UI benefits or COVID as being the reason for the difficulty hiring. And in the summer, that was about 12% of the difficult to fill vacancies mentioned UI benefits or COVID. And most of them mentioned UI benefits and not COVID. But that really speaks to people maybe having a financial cushion, which can affect workers' choices and impact their lives amid this like ongoing pandemic. And yeah, so we've kind of reached this. Everything about the past 18 months has been historic, unprecedented, all the words that we've heard a million times, but it is true. And we had an extreme amount of job losses. We've had a really fast recovery, and it's looked really different from a lot of previous recessions. I think in coming out of recession, many employers thought it would be like the previous recession, where there'd be a lot of people out of work and a lot of people that needed work, and it would be pretty easy to hire for their open position, but that's turned out to not be the case for sure. And that's all I have for y'all today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we have any hands raised? I can start with a question. I'm wondering if you noticed, or if you have data on any shifts in the types of people who are working and taking jobs in different industries, like in terms of their education level or things like that.
No, we don't have any. We usually have annual data on that, so we haven't seen anything look too different in 2020. I think maybe there might, I would think maybe there might be some changes in the ages of workers. I know the McDonald's down the street from me has a big sign up that says now hiring 14 to 15-year-olds. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we did see a really sharp change in the gender breakout of the labor force. Women were leaving the labor force and were unemployed at much higher rates than men. But over the recovery, that has really equaled out.
Yeah, I also wonder if with well, I'll give a quick one, then there's a hand up. With more, it's like a worker's market, more jobs available, if people might be able to find jobs closer to home. So if that would affect commuting distance. I don't know. That's just a speculation.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you've
yeah,
seen that.
I think. Yeah, we about people who commute out of their county to work based on where they live, which doesn't necessarily get at to whether they're working closer to home or not, in a more granular level. But I think the general idea of more worker choice is really true, which is why employers are having a hard time, because when every business on the block is hiring, they have the opportunity to pick, which maybe wasn't the case before.
Okay. I see Dennis Yee has hand up. Dennis?
Morning. I have two questions. Wondering if Anna, you could try to answer or address what the department has been looking at. The prospects of long-term work from home. Is the employment outlook changed? That is, more people will either do a hybrid or work from home exclusively as a result that businesses have learned that this works. And then secondly, my second question is about daycare and the intermittent nature of schooling because of COVID restrictions, where someone gets infected on the bus and the entire school or parts of the school are closed down again, and the lack of daycare options perhaps holding back employment right now for let's call it marginally displaced workers right now.
Yeah, those
So-
are two great questions. Thanks. Yeah, so for work from home, at the beginning of the pandemic, the census was asking kind of monthly, are you working from home because of COVID? And obviously that shot up at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's kind of steadied. I think it's around like 6 or 8% in Oregon recently. And Oregon has, which is a little higher than the US average, and Oregon's always had a little bit higher work from home than average. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting to watch in the future, because it's really going to vary by industry, and it probably will vary a lot by income level. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think we keep saying like, oh, at the, in 2021, once all the vaccines are rolled out, we'll see how this kind of shakes out. And then that didn't happen as we expected. The state government hasn't gone back into the office as a whole yet. Yeah, so I don't know. I think each individual employer is going to have big difference. And then your other question was about schooling and childcare, which is a huge impact, which has been really important. It's always really important, but there's a couple different things going on. One, I didn't show the industry graph for this, but childcare industry and childcare workers has really dropped over the pandemic, and they haven't gained a lot of those jobs back. So there's a decrease in the supply of childcare workers. Schools are having a really hard time hiring. And then there's the intermittent nature of COVID restrictions changing, individual schools closing down or not closing down because of exposures. So a lot of the census does a pulse survey, and they ask people why they are not urgently seeking work right now. And childcare concerns are one of the major reasons why. So it really is, I think, one of the biggest impacts that's keeping people out of the labor force and making it more difficult for employers to find workers. Because if you have to stay at home with your kid, it can really, and you need to be in the office or you need to be working during certain hours, it can really affect your availability and just make it impossible to work. And then I see there's a question, do you have the percentage of people who are work from home due to COVID broken out by urban areas? Yes, I think you can. Josh Lehner at the Office of Economic Analysis, he has some great blog posts on this. And I think I don't remember the percentages, but I know that Portland had higher percentages than other other urban areas and the rural areas. And then Becky, are there indications of wages rising to attract workers? Yes, some. We were seeing that a lot, kind of beginning of this year and end of last year, in that private average hourly wages, there was pretty steady increase. But that's kind of started to wane a little bit. In the job vacancy survey, when you adjust for inflation, the wages, the average wages that employers were offering for their vacancies was lower than it was last summer. And then do we collect attitudinal data on workers wanting to change industries? No, I don't think we do. No, not that I know of. Yes, thank you, Becky. Yeah.
Yeah, you sent that to me. I asked you for that a few months ago, and it's like, and I have this. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else have questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Anna. That was very interesting.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
I guess interest of time, we'll just keep on moving here. So I will give myself, or I'll share my own screen here. So we have a few people speaking about COVID surveys, or surveys done. There it goes. About the travel impacts, basically, of COVID. Give myself a very short introduction. I've been working for more years than I care to admit, about 35 in this, mostly in travel demand modeling. In fact, the first activity-based model I worked on was for Portland Metro back when Keith Lawton was there in the mid 90s. And I also work on a lot of our survey research. We'll be working on the Oregon statewide travel survey the next couple of years. And so I'll be talking, this was the survey that RSG sort of did on our own money. And just to keep track of the trends during the pandemic, it's a nationally representative repeated cross-sectional survey. And to date, we've fielded it 9 times from May 2020 to September 2021, which was last month. So it's an online survey, first administered in May 2020, with a new wave every 2 months or so, about 3,000 people per wave. We use a national online panel that we've used for a lot of projects in the past that are pretty high quality data, called Full Circle. And then we reweight the data. So the questionnaire has over 100 questions, which have changed a little bit over the waves, but these are the main topics we look at. I'm going to be focusing on teleworking today and travel replacement a little bit, but we also have about all these other things, including about changes in employment, which the last presentation was on. So we do weighting into 5 different regions of the country, and with both household level and person level controls from the 2019 ACS PUMS. So each wave is weighted to the same targets, and we use some targets that are combinations of things like race and ethnicity and income, or gender, by whether there's children or not in the household, and other things, so we can get it single parent households. So now we have over 27,000 over the 9 waves. The weighting doesn't change things too much. They do a pretty good job at getting unweighted data that at least along race, ethnicity, and age is pretty close to the actual distributions. By income and education, we have to change things a little bit. So this shows the timing of the waves with the arrows relative to how severe the pandemic has been in the 5 different regions in terms of people per million hospitalized with COVID. And you see there's the 4 waves there, and they've differed a lot by parts of the country. And I think right now, already in September and even since then, it's been hospitalization rates have been going down in most of the country. But when we look at the data, we see there are responses in different parts of the country that sort of correlate with what's happening in terms of the severity of the number of cases there. Nice. So I'm only going to show a few. I mean, we could show hundreds of slides from this, but I'll just focus on a few today because of time that I think are most very relevant. So teleworking is big, and so this is the average days per week people report teleworking, and we look at it by industry type. And pre-COVID is over here on the right, which we asked people like a typical week before March, whatever, 2020. And then, so you see in the retail and hospitality industry, working from home has stayed low the whole pandemic. Raised up a little bit at first. Some jobs in that industry, people can work from home, but it stayed low. Same for health services has stayed pretty low. Also construction and industry, the yellow line. So those are kind of the essential jobs. The high one, of course, is professional services, which started out as the highest in terms pre-COVID, but is still, according to our data, like 3 days per week on average. And other jobs in there. The real outlier here is education, teaching, which went way up at first and over time has come down to be an essential service again as schools have opened, and now is about as low as it was pre-COVID almost. So an interesting thing, so we asked people who are working from home during each wave, how many days per week they would like to keep working from home. And that average hasn't changed much over time or across industry groups. It's about 4 days per week. Of course, that's the people who are still working from home, which changes over time. But then we ask how likely your employer would be to allow you to work that desired number of days from home with an average. It's an average score where 1 is very unlikely, 5 is very likely. For most industries, especially education, there's kind of a self-sorting going on. The people who can't work from home are going back to work, but the people who are still working from home are pretty confident that they can keep doing it and will be allowed to, because maybe they have the type of jobs where that's available. The real outlier there is the professional services, where since May 21, which is about the time where most people were getting vaccinated, people who are still working from home are becoming less optimistic that they can remain working from home their desired number of days, although that's still above neutral, that score, so still fairly optimistic. And another thing we found there is that we also ask people how long until they think their offices will reopen, the people who are still working from home. And right after, it's not shown here, but right after the May 21, people in the professional services thought that their offices would be opening in the next month or so, a lot of them. And that turned out not to happen because of the Delta wave and different things. So now the estimates are going back up again. A lot of people don't think their offices will be opening very soon. So, or at least the people who are still working from home. So there's a lot still more we can unpack in that data over time. So we look at the frequency of how often people are using their cars. And the number one variable in that, at least during the initial months of COVID, was whether they're working from home or not. And you see that people who are teleworking every day use their cars even less frequently than people who weren't even employed, their green line. And people who commuted all their work days, within a few months, their travel was back up to, their car frequency of car use was back up to pre-COVID levels and has even gone above that now. But you see that all of the groups have increased their frequency of car use quite a bit, which kind of agrees with what Becky was showing. And although this is just frequency, not actual traffic. And the difference between these lines is groups has shrunk. So that suggests that all the groups are driving more often for non-commute purposes, since this segmentation sort of covers the commute purpose. So I'll just show one more slide about shopping and meals. This is one of the reasons people are traveling. Two of the reasons people are traveling more often are going to restaurants. So eating meals in restaurants went down a lot, and now it's back up even above getting food to take out or deliveries. And also over here, shopping and grocery stores went down some compared to pre-COVID, now is back pretty high. These pre-COVID estimates might be a little low, but the interesting thing is that if deliveries versus going to restaurants and stores were actually substitutes, you would expect these lower lines to be going down as people go back, but that's not happening. They keep going up, which suggests to me that people have changed their behavior. So delivery services have there's a lot more of them. They're offering better deals. And so people may think, well, I'm still going to get some of my groceries delivered, and there's other ones that I want to go out and buy at the store. So they're doing both, which isn't too good for traffic because you get people going to the stores and people and trucks delivering things to them. The same for meals. So, and we looked at correlations between these things, and they're always positive. So there doesn't really seem to be any substitution going on there. So that's a question that I'll bring back up for discussion later. But right now, I'll go on to our other panelists, if I can stop sharing my screen here. Wait a minute. Let's see, is Ram here yet? Yes, he is. Okay. So Ram, if you can share your screen, and I'll give you a quick introduction.
Will do. Thank you. Will do. Thank you. So let me make this work. Oh, so I think for me to share, you have to stop sharing. But
Oh, I stopped sharing. I don't know.
okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, wait a minute here. Just have to get to the page with your, there we go. Okay, so Ram Pandyala is a professor of transportation systems at the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University, and is the director of TomNet, a US DOT funded Tier 1 University Transportation Center. His expertise lies in a study of travel behavior and understanding the role of various factors in shaping human mobility choices. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Ram.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I just want to say that this is an honor and a privilege to share some of the work we've been doing, trying to understand the implications of COVID for the future of travel and human activities and mobility choices. Do pardon me, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so but I'll try to get through without much of an issue. So I do want to start off by saying that I'm merely the messenger today. The real heavy lift and all the work has really been done by an amazingly glorious team across Arizona State University and University of Illinois, Chicago. The faculty members involved, Dr. Deborah Salon, Kuros Mohammedian, Sybil Deribel, and all of our fantastic and wonderful students. So really all credit and all work really goes to the glorious team. In fact, I couldn't quite fit everybody on one slide, so I just thought this would cover it and acknowledge what they have done. So with that, let me just say the COVID Future Survey is trying to measure respondent attitudes, lifestyle, work from home, mode use and travel patterns, e-shopping, air travel. And in each of the surveys, we ask, what they have done, what they're doing now, and what do they expect to do or experience once the pandemic is no longer a threat. And obviously, there's just a tremendous amount of interest with respect to this question as to what COVID means for our future. And there's lots of statistics and white papers out there. So the COVID Future Survey, I encourage you to check covidfuture.org. It's an online longitudinal survey, pretty much implemented in Qualtrics. We have recruited folks through a combination strategy. So it's an online Qualtrics panel. We bought an email database from Info Group. So, 500,000 emails, addresses, and randomly just, random email database and just blasted out our survey to this database. And then a convenience sample, which may include some of you, our friends and family and colleagues and so on. And so it is a nationwide survey, but you can see how in the figure, we have some amount of heaviness with respect to the sample in the larger populated states and in Arizona, simply because, we're here. And so we really hit Arizona in a big way, and we're able to get a large number of responses for Arizona. So we have 3 waves of data collection planned. Wave 1, we got nearly 10,000 responses. It went from April to October of 2020. The second wave, in other words, in each wave, we're just going back to the same people who responded in the previous wave. So we sent out again to the 9,900 folks for wave 2, and we got the 3,100 responses. And wave 2 went from November to May. So our waves are kind of extended waves during which actually the pandemic has evolved and protocols have changed and so on. But we do know the date of each response. And so you can do some filtering if you want to see what's going on with people, pre-vaccination versus post-vaccination and things like that. We did ensure that there is a 6-month gap between people answering wave 1 and wave 2. So somebody who answered in October 2020, they were not invited for wave 2 until late spring of 2021. So we always maintain at least a 6-month gap between wave 1 and wave 2 responses. The wave 1 data has been released. There are some publications. We also have short papers in findings. And I encourage you to check those out. The wave 1 data is available on the ASU Dataverse. Just go to covidfuture.org and you can access the 10,000 records, raw data, all cleaned and weighted. So wave 3 is in progress. We started deploying October right, just now. I mean, so wave 3 is just underway. It's about 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the logic chain that you have to follow through the survey. We're planning some reminder protocols, and you'll notice that we're having some promising responses. So we've sent, 8,000 plus responses, and so far, we actually have a very good response rate, I would think, for a panel. So folks are kind of sticking with us. So far, we have 1,700 responses. And again, these are all folks who at least answered wave. So will behaviors and activities evolve substantially into the new normal? Some thought leaders say yes, while others think not. I myself, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, was more in the not category. But as the pandemic has extended and gone on forever and ever, I feel less and less that is the case. And I do think that there will be a permanent evolution into a new normal. The question is, to what extent? We asked a broad question in wave 1, where we just said, the pandemic has forced us to do lots of things differently, work from home, go to school from home, have things delivered, stay at home, et cetera, not travel, do everything through Zoom meetings and so on. And we just asked a general question. Would you like to continue any of these new ways of living after COVID-19 is no longer a threat? And you can see about a third say yes, they'd like to continue at least some aspects of this life. 25% no, and 43% are were kind of on the fence. But again, all of wave 1 is from 2020. So it is clearly a year old now. Now, when we look at these surveys and consider what's going on with their behaviors, we do have to consider changes in social demographics. This is just an example to show, again, this is from wave 1, we actually found nearly a 30%, 30+% indicate that their income changed and changed downward. So we do feel that we need to account for these types of sociodemographic effects when understanding what's happening with behaviors over time. Here's the socioeconomic distribution of weighted and unweighted panel samples, very similar to Mark. We pretty much divided the country into regions and then weighted with respect to household and person characteristics. Here I'm showing the person characteristics. And you can see that in our unweighted, we actually have more old people who the raw sample, this is the stayer sample, by the way. So more of the older folks, we do have slightly more orientation towards females, more educated. Employment is not all that off, but then minorities are underrepresented, Hispanic and non-white. And so we did have to do weighting to account for what's happening with this stayer sample.
Can you wrap up in a few minutes, Ram?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is the option to work from home, and you can see that option to work from home from pre-pandemic all the way to post-pandemic. What I really wanted to show here is that the expectation of having the option to work from home is really dependent on income and education. So you can actually see these equity issues showing up quite a bit, but nearly half, on average, nearly half expect to have the option to at least work from home partially, not necessarily fully. Here's the work from home from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, and post-pandemic is expected. And you can see from the no option, you can see that nearly 50% don't expect to have that option in the future. You can see some folks unemployed went back into employment. Frequent telecommuting definitely increases from 16 to 34% infrequent, which is once a week or less. So once a week or less kind of goes down from the pre-pandemic, and there's a pickup of frequent. Here's the travel mode, again, as you would expect. So private vehicle saw so just not commuting really saw the big increase, both in wave 1 and wave 2. But in the post-pandemic, there seems to be a lot of thought about returning to the private vehicle as a mode to work. Now, transit will pick back up a little bit. Transit at 10.9%, here it went down to 3.5 and 4.6, but it could come back to about 7.5%, so not 100% recovery, but hopefully better than what it is now. I'm going to share this presentation. I won't go through some of this. We asked people in-depth questions as to why they wanted to decrease or increase work from home. And you can see the reasons: more distractions at home, more comfortable workspace. The big one is no commuting. So the absence of the commute has been welcome to a lot of folks. Here is number of days per week that people expect to commute. So this is number of commute days. And you can see before COVID, 4+ days a week, you're going into the workplace. And then wave 1 and wave 2, not a lot of difference, but you can see this little bump at 5 days a week. And then here's post-COVID. Here's what people expect. A lot of 5 days a week, but then you have a lot of zeros and somewhere in between as well. So kind of 3-ish days a week in the future. Here is non-grocery shopping. Again, a lot of evolution. Because this is a panel sample, we can really see how these folks have evolved and expect to evolve with respect to their online non-grocery shopping. Here are the reasons. So again, saving time seems to be quite a big aspect. Here's air travel. Here's mode use. And so you can see among former users, so people who used to do personal flying and business flying, you can see the blue represents less. That is, in the post-pandemic, do you expect to do less of it? And you can see business is considerably less compared to personal. Here is walking and bicycling. And again, former users versus non-users. And you can see former users really picking up walking and biking. So that is quite promising. So again, here is changes in air travel. And you can see for business, the big reason is I realized I could conduct my meetings by conference call and video conference, and I expect a reduced budget for travel. So that essentially explains what's going on with air travel. Here is telemedicine, and you can see telemedicine picking up. This is during the pandemic and what they expect to do in the future. And you can see there's quite a bit of telemedicine possibilities in the future. Attitudes do make a big difference. So attitudes towards COVID, attitudes towards the pandemic, attitudes towards the economy and the disruptions actually affect how people respond to the pandemic. So what might our future look like? Can cities support allocating more street space for alternative modes and outdoor dining? Certainly a lot of interest there. And so will these expectations become actual change? Time will tell, but we hope this data will be useful from that standpoint. Thank you, Mark, for indulging. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ram. We'll have one more speaker before we open up to questions, if we have time. So next speaker is Giovanni Trucella from, he's the Honda Distinguished Scholar for New Mobility Studies and the director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at the University of California, Davis, and a senior research engineer at the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. So he's got a long telecommute there, all right, long commute. Dr. Trucella is leading a major research effort on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're going to hear something about. He's the chair of the Transportation TRB Standing Committee on information and communication technology and transportation, and a member of the Travel Behaviors and Values Committee. The rest you can read in the agenda. So Giovanni, if you can share your screen, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. So let me attempt to share my screen. I noticed while Ram was speaking that I started to have a little bit of internet problems. Sometimes the voice of Ram was breaking up for me. I hope you will be able to hear me.
Yeah, maybe if you turn the video off during your presentation, that might help.
While I talk okay, perfect. So first of all, like Ram, I need to acknowledge a long team of long list of names in my presentation and beyond. I'm listing here three main colleagues. Summer Jorgensen, she's an extremely smart PhD student that's been actually doing a lot of the analysis in the slides that we'll present today. Jay Malik, that is really working, another PhD student, finishing his work now at UC Davis, very smart and really doing a lot of the reporting work for this project. And Michelle Young, that who is now an assistant professor in Toronto, but that has been co-leading this research with me for quite a bit of time over the past year and a half. I have many more names that I will list in the final slide at the end. And this project really that we've been leading has really been trying to investigate the temporary versus long-term components of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on transportation. So a lot of things in common with what Ram and Mark were presenting before, but also some slight differences. So somehow I think the three presentations complement each other rather well to really discuss what we have learned so far about the impacts of the pandemic. So I don't need to really express the interest that we had in investigating the impacts of the pandemic on travel behavior. The excellent presentations today have really shown a lot of the changes that have been happening in transportation during the pandemic, including the substantial rebound of a lot of the vehicle miles travel that have come back recently during 2021. However, one thing that I want to point is that as some of the presentations have shown, the spatio-temporal distribution of trips and the distribution by mode has really changed quite a bit. And the use of passively collected data is very useful to really try to capture these patterns. But really, in our study, we really wanted to understand who is responsible for these changes and really how the likelihood that these changes might extend in the future might really affect the future of transportation and the use of the infrastructure. And so for this study, somehow we were a little bit, I don't want to use the word lucky because we're talking about a national tragedy with more than 700,000 people that died. So let's say that we had some conditions that made our research easier. I don't want to use the word luck in this tragedy. And the reason is that we could build on some previous data collection that we conducted right before the pandemic. So in 2018 and 2019, with funding from Caltrans, the National Center for Sustainable Transportation and the US DOT, we actually launched two large data collections. One was in California, the other one focused on 8 large metro areas of the United States. And so we had quite a bit of data that was collected before the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, at that time, we had no idea that a major pandemic would have struck the country. But really, this provides some real benchmark and information about all the variables that we are interested in studying, including household organization, telecommuting, travel choices, use of e-shopping, and so on, right before the pandemic. And so during the pandemic, we launched a first round of data collection in spring 2020. We targeted in particular data collections in 15 regions of the United States and 2 regions in Canada, 2020. And so somehow we built this longitudinal component of the data with the third data point when possible for the same respondents, but also we refreshed the sample, adding additional respondents at each wave. And we just completed an additional round of data collection, so it would be round 4 in spring, summer 2021. The results are not included yet in this presentation because we are still processing them. We have more than 11,000 respondents from this round of data collection. So some of them are actually the same respondents from the past, some are not. And we will plan to continue this round of data collection again in next year. So we will not have another round in this fall, but we will have another one in spring, summer 2022, exactly 1 year after this one, to really see how patterns evolve during the recovery after the pandemic. We use a mixed sampling approach, so a little bit of structure about the database. We started with these respondents that were largely coming from the use of a online opinion panel, as well as a stratified random sample of individuals in California that were really invited to their home address. So we printed invitations and questionnaires, we send them to their home in 2018, 2019. During spring 2020, we resample as much as possible the previous respondents. We had about 1,300 respondents that are the same from the previous round. We also invited thousands of new respondents with this new round of data collection. And I need to mention, in this round, we largely used online opinion panels, mainly because of the need to go in the field very quickly when the pandemic hit. In fall 2020, winter 2021, we came back with another large round of data collection. Some of the respondents are the same. Again, we included new recruitment of new respondents. And now we are working still at organizing all the massive amount of data that we collected in spring, summer 2021. At this round, we use all the previous methods of data collection, using a convenience sample, an online opinion panel, using the longitudinal component, inviting again the same respondents from the previous ways, but also we're doing a stratified random sample of California households. So we mail 60,000 invitations in the USPS mail. Of these, 50,000 were invitations to do the survey online, and 10,000 were invitations to do the survey with a printed questionnaire that we mailed, both in English and Spanish. So we really try to do our best efforts to reduce all sampling biases and all issues that we have usually, in which minorities tend to participate less in studies, or we have, for example, an overrepresentation of individuals that are able to telework and work remotely. We will come back to this topic in my last slide in this presentation. The survey content was pretty much consistent in all different versions of the surveys that we used. So we have major sections collecting information about attitudes and preferences, use of technology, adoption of telework, work activities, household organization, online shopping, in-person shopping, travel choices, the use of new travel modes, but also information, detailed information about vehicle ownership and changes in vehicle ownership. We're actually developing vehicle transaction models to really estimate who has bought a vehicle during the pandemic and what type of vehicle they bought, and whether this was an expansion of the number of vehicles in the household or it was a replacement of a vehicle already in the household, and also propensity towards the new alternative fuel vehicles and so on. And of course, like, household individual social demographics to really link this information to who is making these changes. I want to point in a summary slide some key findings, and then I hope I will have a few minutes to talk more extensively about some of these. So one of these, as Mark and Ram has discussed extensively, there was a major shift into remote work during the pandemic. This was particularly strong among higher income and higher education workers. Our data showed that about 25% of respondents expect to continue to work remotely after the pandemic is over, with the frequency that is higher, so more often than they did before the pandemic. We can return to this about, really discussing how these findings can be generalized to the population because of that big potential issues that we overrepresent with online surveys, those that are able to work from home. I also want to point that our data has been showing that while there was a reduction in use by all modes during the peak of the pandemic with an increase in walking and non-commute travel, one thing that was very concerning is that approximately 1/3 of those that reduced the use of transit have massively switched to driving. So that is actually something that we're trying to will hold in the future, is somehow a concerning issue, because if habits are formed as those individuals don't return to transit, it might just be easy for them to stay using their private vehicle. In shopping, there was a big increase in shopping adoption, and one thing that is very important, a little bit like Mark was mentioning, that e-shopping is here to stay, there was an expansion of the user base among non-traditional users. Our models of using e-shopping show that e-shopping increase also among non-traditional e-shoppers. This includes older individuals, individuals that don't live in urban areas. So somehow those individuals that before the pandemic didn't really include e-shopping in their usual choices. So this actually makes the potential perseverance of this pattern more likely, because once somebody starts using a new service and there is the initial adoption, the friction of continuing to doing that thing is actually lower. Delivery apps is an interesting thing. Maybe Mark, I would love to discuss more about this, because what we see in our analysis of who is doing these things, it's mainly popular among the young, urban, dynamic population in urban areas. It's also true that we see a strong correlation between the delivery apps, the use of delivery apps, and those that reduce the in-person dining in restaurants. So that actually makes us think that when the things will go back to more normal patterns, and this they are already doing with 2021, and actually I really want to dive into more, like, adding to these, like, the results from the last wave that we just completed in summer 2021. My feeling is that I wouldn't be surprised if that frequency, at least, of the delivery apps will start to go down, and as things start to go back to normal. So a little bit more, like, difference between the two patterns, with traditionally shopping and new on-demand delivery services. And finally, vehicle ownership. We haven't talked a lot in the previous presentation about vehicle ownership. I want to mention this because it's a very important issue. Vehicle ownership is not only important because, of course, the vehicle purchases during 2020, 2021 were heavily affected by, first, the psychological response and the lockdown to the pandemic, with a big drop in the number of vehicles that were sold. Then there was a rebound, but also there were huge supply issues that increased prices. So it's really difficult in this case to distinguish the supply from the demand. But the issue that is here is that we see a pretty strong increased interest in vehicle ownership among those individuals that were living in zero vehicle households. And this is translating among those that were living in zero vehicle household or low vehicle owning households. Among those that were doing it by choice. So I'm not talking about those by necessity, they cannot afford a car. Of course, it's a different story, it's an equity issue, but it's not a market issue. When we look at those that are doing it by choice, many of them started buying the first vehicle in the household, or moved from having only one vehicle in the household to two vehicles in the household, for example, if you're two adults. And that is actually something that could have quite a bit of impact in the medium term, because, of course, the higher vehicle access in the household might actually generate easier travel by car in the future. So
can you finish up in 2 minutes?
I will do my best. I don't need to stress, like, the differences in the adoption of telework in the different income categories. And so these slides show really our longitudinal data showing, like, the changes that were happening among the different groups of workers. But the next slides, I really want to show some major differences in 6 big groups that we identified. Among those, there were commuting during the pandemic and kept commuting. They were commuting before the pandemic and kept commuting during the pandemic. Those that adopted telework during the pandemic, those that actually started to commute in person, those that were not commuting before and after. And this slide is really shown using data from 2019 versus 2020, only for the SCAG region, the greater Los Angeles area. The results are very consistent when we look at other regions of the country. We did it for simplicity now. This analysis assembled for the Los Angeles region, mainly for sample size. And the thing I want to point is that if we look at the differences in these groups, they are striking in the characteristics of this individual. I want just to point, and for those that are interested, we have a working paper accepted for TRB presentation, and we are in the process of publishing in the journal, really discussing these different patterns, in particular the adoption of telework that was much higher among the better educated, but also the urban population that tended to be already having more urban lifestyles, but also very different patterns among the others. And we have started looking at the changes in frequency by mode, purpose, and the use of various type of transportation by groups to really identify who is responsible for these trips, we started interested how really some individuals were really responsible for the bulk of the reduction in commuting trips, while there, for example, there is a general patterns in non-commuting travel, so that can be seen among a lot of different groups of individuals. So wrapping up, we mentioned about the expectation for when the pandemic is over. Our results are largely in line with what other studies future. Our data show that on average is roughly 2 days a week is what the individuals expect to do after the pandemic is over. But one thing I want to stress really is that a lot of our data, and this is not a criticism to our study or RAM study or Mark study, I would say that every study I've seen so far during the pandemic is even based on online survey data or perhaps phone interviews. And these studies seem to systematically overrepresent individuals that were able to telework during the pandemic, but even before. And with Ram and Pat Mokhtar and other great colleagues, we've been discussing extensively. I had a conversation with Deborah just last week, Deborah Salon. We are trying to use the ACS data or NHTS or any kind of information to try to reweight based not on social demographics, but also on the ability to work from home before the pandemic. But the reality is that sometimes even ACS data, they have a very, very vague definition of who was teleworking before the pandemic because of their usual mode of commute they use. So in our study, we are also doing now quite a bit of paper surveys and stratify random sample of the true population to really try to quantify that potential bias and really try to show how we could correct this data, also to account for potential overs. VNT is back. Peak travel is still below in many areas, in particular during the AM peak. So I would say the pandemic seems to be buying us some time to fight congestion, but clearly these patterns are coming back, and so probably we have 1-2 more years or some more time to make policy decisions that are important, but still very important, that consider that things are coming back in a different way, but also a lot of the problems will be back also during the peak time, most likely, also as the regions grow and more workers will need to travel around. I will pause here. We have our great team here, but also I want to point to our website where you can find a lot of information on this study, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Giovanni. Yeah, these slides will be available to everybody. So Carol says we can go a little bit longer in the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for Giovanni or Ram or myself, go ahead. Don't see any hands raised at the moment. There's one in the chat box from Alex Bettinardi about if the weighting includes occupation type or industry type.
Yes. So I don't know which survey Alex was asking about, but our COVID future survey does cover a wide range of occupation types, and we did use that as a control variable. I just couldn't fit all the controls in one slide to show the full table, but we did control at a somewhat aggregate level.
Yeah, in our survey, we added education level as a control, and that seemed to help. So that the extent of teleworking we saw matched like federal Department of Labor surveys and things like that. So we didn't seem to be getting too much teleworking in our survey, at least early on. I don't know we haven't redone that lately. But no, it would be a fair amount of work to do by industry type because you'd have to use a different data source for that, but it might be a good idea.
Yeah, and in our data also we use we don't use the exact industry type. As Mark said, it would be quite a bit of fair amount of work, but we use employment, we use education, we use all other social demographics, and we use the ability to work from home status before the pandemic. So using like to rescale based on that.
Mhm. Any further questions? Just a comment for Giovanni. I would be interested to see what you find about the delivery services, especially grocery, food delivery for your next wave, because I thought too that it would go down, but it didn't seem to go down. And we actually saw during the early months of COVID a lot of older people using grocery delivery. Maybe they were more worried about being catching or being infected, but so we haven't looked at that by age group lately.
Yeah, I would love to follow up on that, Mark. Our data, I need to look into the age distribution. Certainly, it's a pretty urban phenomenon, and higher educated, higher income for the app-based delivery. For the e-shopping, has gone much more like into the non-traditional users, so older individuals, non-urban residents, and so on. So we saw quite a bit of an uptick in traditionally shopping, Amazon, let's say, and that type of services, in particular in correlation with those that said that were non-traditional users and they were concerned about the impact of the pandemic on health. And so like, more senior individuals and those that wanted to avoid contact in shops. But for the delivery apps, mainly urban phenomenon among the higher educated, higher income, the typical early adopters, I would say. But I would be interested, happy to follow up about the continuing patterns in new wave of data.
Let's see, any other questions out from the audience or from the panel? I know it was a lot of information to take in a short amount of time. So and yeah, it will be interesting over the coming year, and so to keep comparing the results from these surveys and other ones that are happening to get a coherent story. You always want to see, evidence from more than one study before you actually believe it. So the more things agree, the more confident we can be. But I still don't think we can really predict what's going to happen myself as we come out of the pandemic, partly because we can't really predict what's going to happen with the pandemic itself, which could also change things quite a bit. So any closing comments along those lines from Ram or Giovanni?
No, indeed. That's why I had in my last slide, time will tell how things will evolve. I still think there's a little bit of a disconnect perhaps between workers and employers with respect to the extent of working from home. So it'll be interesting to see where they meet in the middle. But I expect that we will see on any given day certainly a 10 to 15% higher level of telecommuting, post-pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what's going to happen with the really long range telecommuting, like people who work hundreds of miles away from their workplace.
Yeah, right. So you'll have more remote workers.
Yeah, and apart from the commuting, that is an interesting question. I think there are some other forms like work-related travel that will be impacted in the longer term. I mean, we see today how like meetings, for example, with clients or partners and so on, are much more accepted online, and I think that will stay with us. Like I don't really foresee like having to travel all the time to go to meet the agencies with which we work in person all the time in the future, as we used to do before the pandemic. I used to do probably once a week. I was in Sacramento almost once a week from Davis here. It's only a few miles, but we don't need to do it anymore. We just do a call. And I see like that is not really commuting trips. There's a lot of work-related travel that is changing, and I think that will have certainly like of course percentage-wise it's much smaller than the commuting trip, the number of commuting trips, but that will be something that, for example, is probably here to stay. I also think like the other thing Mark was mentioning, the long distance telecommuters. I think another thing to monitor that will be very interesting is the evolution in the real estate. We're already seeing like the use of office space as being slightly reorganized in many companies. I mean, perhaps like California is an exception. The economy of certain states in the US, Washington State, California, and others, with the presence of the computer industry, it's like particularly an exception, but it's a big sector, and we see already like using a lot more of form of flexibility in the office space, and just the square footage per employee starting to be different because companies reorganize their organization and will also want to optimize their budget sheet in the end.
Yeah, the RSG Portland office, for example, is moving to more flexible workspace. So yeah, my colleague John Slayson put a link in I think to some other slides, but we haven't really written a report yet. That was what the question asked, like a comprehensive report. We'd love to do that, maybe over Christmas vacation or something. So I think that's all the time we have. So we'll move on to, does anyone have announcements they would like to make about events or other things?
Hi, Mark. This is Kyle Hauger with Portland Metro. I'm on the coordinating committee of OMUG, so this might be a good spot for me to jump in and just update folks on what's ahead in terms of next OMUG sessions and what's coming in 2022. Before I do that, I do want to thank all the presenters today. It was quite an interesting topic, of course, but the depth and breadth that you guys really covered today was outstanding, and so lots to take away. I'll put in the chat a link to Oregon Models. I believe it's oregonmodels.org. It's our website, and let's see, I'll post that now. I think that's going to be, I know it's going to be a good refresher for me to go back once these presentations get posted today, because you can actually, we do post them on a YouTube channel, I believe. And so we can take in all this information again and again and again if we so need to. But thanks to everyone presenting today. So future sessions, there's going to be an activity sim project update in winter 2022. That's kind of what we have slated for that. So that's the open source activity-based travel modeling software package and project. Looking forward to an update on that in winter of the new year. Also, this has been an ongoing tradition here with our OMUG group. We do a post-TRB brown bag. Last year was the first Zoom brown bag luncheon that we had. Typically, we've met in person at PSU, Portland State University, and it's been kind of a round table where a few folks that attend the session, kind of bring back what may be relevant to Oregon or to their work in particular. It's just kind of a nice informal way to catch the group up on some of the happenings of TRB. Now, TRB does return to an in-person format this year. It's happening January 9th through the 13th. And so we will be typically a couple weeks after that session, so late January, first part of February, we'll have our post-TRB brown bag. And we'll be tapping the shoulders of a few folks that attend the session in person to kind of share their experiences. Coming up in later 2022 DTA assignments. I know there's at least one application happening here locally that potentially we can get an update for. There's some TNC work in first and last mile transit topics that are of interest to this group. And then Metro's mobility policy update. Like to get a speaker in and cover the nuances of that work that's happening for the RTP here in the Portland Metro area. Again, just lastly, wanted to mention the Oregon Models site. If you're new to this meeting today, it's a good chance to join the mailing list and you'll get an announcement for these upcoming sessions that I mentioned. It's also where the OMUG archives are, so you can see past presentations, whether it be video or PowerPoints. And you can also see some of the Oregon Modeling Steering Committee, kind of the org chart of our group, and contacts for specific topics in transportation modeling that may be of interest to you, or land use modeling, just Oregon models in general. So that would be a good resource for you to potentially bookmark if you want to learn more about our group. So with that, I think I'll I guess I'll pass it back to you, Mark, for a few closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. Yeah, I think the COVID subject, I think there was a lot of really good information today and good presentations. And it's nice to have the different types of data together, the traffic and the employment data and the survey data, because they all fill in different pieces of the puzzle. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more work coming. It's interesting to think in terms of modeling how this needs, it's not just a question of what's going to happen, but it's a question of how to model things so that models can be responsive to what happens. And I think maybe more attention to industrial sectors of industry that might be showing very different types of commute behavior might be one thing. Maybe more attention to substitution or the growth of delivery services and small commercial vehicles, and whether or not that substitutes for individual travel. So that's just a couple things. I'm sure there's lots more, but we're out of time. And thank you to all our presenters and to all you for attending, and look forward to more meetings in the future. Thank you.